Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, which is Capture One in Architecture with my very special guest, Paul Reiffer. If this is your first webinar and you don't know who the mystery voices are, I'm the guy at the top. My name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And Paul, I think you're there, hopefully.
Yep, I'm here.
You are here, that's good. And then we've also got Paul all the way from, not exactly that far from Denmark, but all the way from England, UK, the south coast, although from what I understand, Paul, you're not really there a great deal. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, always traveling around. So Paul's going to show us some good stuff in Capture One. As usual, we have around 60 minutes to play with, and you're very welcome and encouraged to ask questions throughout. The way you do that is at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see a section called questions, so put a question in there that will come through to me and I will feed them through to Paul as and when. There is quite a lot of you, so don't be disappointed if your specific question isn't asked. We try to get through though as many as possible. I am recording the session too, so don't worry if you don't miss. If you don't catch everything, you can always watch it again on YouTube tomorrow. So that's enough from me, I think, Paul. I'm going to hand the metaphorical torch over to you. Cool. So you should see a pop-up in a second. Yeah.
Let's get that on the screen and it should be there.
Yep, we can see you loud and clear. Or
cool.
clear at the moment, yes. And just a bit of background before we fly into Capture One. So you're primarily architecture and interior photographer, as I said, based in the UK, but working all over the world, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So we shoot a lot for travel companies, for hotels, airlines, and so on. So there's a lot of times you'll see me either on top of a building or hanging off of a building, but around the world. But every now and then we step inside and do the internal stuff as well. So today I'm going to run through 3 or 4 images which cover a bit of a span in terms of focusing on architecture, but also focusing on what we do with cityscape stuff to make it pop. We're going to cover some stuff on white balance and color temperature, because obviously at night we get some strange effects if we get it wrong. And then we'll go through some of the perspective things, especially when we're using wide lenses, and how they can be corrected later on.
Great, fantastic.
So, first off, I'm just going to load up one of the pictures. So all the pictures that we're loading up to begin with are raw. What some of you may find on your screen, so these are images are actually captured with Phase 1's IQ3 100 megapixel back. So they're 16-bit color, which is great. And for me, that's fantastic. I can see a really clear and huge range of color depth in the image. When we're broadcasting it over the web, sometimes the color depth doesn't quite get through. So some people might see a little bit of banding in the sky. I can assure you it's not there. It's just unfortunately the way that the web compresses things. Exactly.
It tends to be sort of areas of single color or with no detail, like the sky.
Yeah. So
we see banding, but yeah, as Paul just said, there is no banding in the shot. It's just the transmission. So
cool. So yeah, first things first. When it comes to especially nighttime stuff, the one thing it took me years to get really the hang of this stuff is simply get it right in the camera. You know, I'm going to show people a lot of changes in a second in terms of what we can do to correct things. But at the end of the day, if you've got highlights that are blown out or you've got shadows that are underexposed, yes, we can tweak it, and certainly things like the IQ3 has got a huge dynamic range, so we can pull back shadows and pull back highlights if we need to. But this all comes down to getting it right first time, and we'll cover sometimes the lens isn't the right lens, sometimes the setup isn't quite perfect. We'll cover that in a second. So this is Dubai. That big building there in the middle is the Burj Khalifa. So that's the tallest building in the world. This is quite a famous viewpoint in Dubai. It's actually taken from the roof of the Shangri-La hotel there. So there are a couple of challenges with this image. The first being this rather annoying but really subtle tilt on the lens. If we look down the left-hand side here of the building where it says Dusit Thani, and the right of this building here, clearly we're looking down. So as the second we do that with a standard lens, you're going to get a little bit of tilt in the perspective. That's fine normally for a cityscape, because if we're looking down from afar, so I'm just going to load up this one, for example, it actually makes sense. The buildings are sort of climbing towards me as we get higher, and that's great. When I've got buildings near the edge of the image, so on these two in the corner, it can be distracting, especially when it's printed or put against a frame. So Capture One's got a fantastic tool to help with that. We're going to go into that in a second as well. So the first thing we're going to do, this is actually shot with a 28mm lens, so we're going to apply some lens correction onto it. In terms of distortion, so a 28mm lens on medium format is equivalent of about 17mm. There will be distortion in this shot. I'm not going to do it too much. I'm not going to overdo it to 100%, but we're just going to put in a little bit of distortion correction. Light fall off is a personal thing. So when we're doing any light or lens corrections here, a lot of people have a tendency to put in 100% light fall off because they believe it's correcting for any vignetting in the lens. Well, what you'll see is now we've overdone it at the edges, and it actually starts to look unnatural. So personally, and again, it is personal preference, I'm not going to pull this above more than about 40%, just to brighten up the edges where I know there is some vignetting, and that makes sense. Especially where we've got high contrast lines, I'm going to get rid of the any purple fringing, especially around lighted areas. So that's my lens correction done, which is great. But now I'm just going to
sorry,
sure.
Paul, just interrupt him. I just wanted to ask you a question. Actually, I saw you ticked diffraction correction, which if people didn't know listening, that's a specific correction for shooting at smaller apertures. So when you shoot at smaller apertures, you soften the image. When do you find you start to actively use that?
To be honest,
which aperture?
Yeah. So on a 28mm lens, I personally use it on anything above about f11. Simply because as we get nearer to the edges, the diffraction actually ends up becoming slightly quite an issue on some images. On something like a 75-150 or a 40-80, you know, f16 plus maybe, but you know, below that you're not going to need it.
Not need it. Okay, interesting. Okay, good to know, because that's kind of what I've been advising people, sort of f11, f16 and above. So it's just good to hear your real world experience. Yeah.
I mean, certainly, obviously, the wider you get, the more of a goldfish bowl lens that you have, the more of an issue you get towards the edges as well. So it sort of starts to creep down the aperture scale. But in general terms, f11 and above, it's not going to do much harm. f16 for sure, and above, especially when we've got high contrast stuff as well.
Yeah, for sure. Cool.
So, so that's the lens correction. But now we're going to use what Capture One does very well, which is Keystone Correction. So the second we're tilting a lens up or down against either vertical or horizontal lines, we're going to get an element of keystoning. It's the same thing that affects projectors when you put them onto walls, and you get the sort of narrow bit at the bottom and the wide bit at the top. The tools that are in here are really, really useful if people use them correctly. So by clicking on this little icon down the bottom, and I've got three options. I can either correct just the vertical keystoning, which is what we actually have the problem with here, just the horizontal keystoning, or I can do this clever little mesh thing that'll do all or both of them at the same time. So all I have to do to correct this little angle that we've got is drag this thing, this left-hand bar, to an area on the screen that's going to be straight, or should be vertically aligned. So actually, let's use this tower, because I'm hoping that one's straight anyway.
You want to hope it would be.
It's new enough not to be bendy yet.
Yeah.
So we're going to pull that one down as a straight line through the middle of the tower. On the right-hand side, this is where sometimes people get a bit confused with this and trying to find where the straight line is. So you need a straight line that's long enough but is definitely straight. So for example, if I take this area here on the top of the roof and then this area down here, actually that's not a straight line, because you can see that this part of the building is actually wider than this part. So the area that I'm going to use is actually this line here on this window pane, because I know that should be straight, it should be vertical. So once I've set those two lines, I'm literally going to hit apply, and we're now going to get an image that's straightened up. So I go from this, which has got a looking down aspect, just going to zoom out a second, to this, which has now got the correct keystone for that image. Now what it has done as well, just to bear in mind, is it's cropped some of the image out. So you can see in here, we've lost some of the image on the left and the right. If that sign was important to us, I've got an option here on the left which says crop outside of image. So actually I know the reason it's cropping in there is because it doesn't want an area with no data in, and obviously because of this angle we lose some on the top left and right. However, I know that I'd want to keep this logo in, and this area up here I can probably clone some of it extra into Photoshop. So what I can do is use this option, which is crop outside the image. And what this lets me do is pull that crop out so I can get the whole of that logo in down here on this hotel. And I could, if I wanted to, crop out here. And I know that this area up here on the top right and this area on the top left is just going to fill with sky when I get into Photoshop. So I'm not too worried about losing that stuff. If it was the areas down here with all the detail, I'd be a lot more worried, obviously. But where it's a flat image, and now obviously we're seeing this slight angle where we're missing some of the picture, but we can get the idea that in Photoshop we'd then fill those areas in. So that's our sort of architecture part of this sorted out. The next part is around actually the lights in the city. And I talked about a dynamic range on Phase 1's cameras being phenomenal, which it is, but even with that, the difference at night between dark parts of a building or this black area of the road down here where there's no lights, and this huge amount of light up here from the car trails on the right-hand side is actually quite phenomenal, and cameras are going to struggle to see it. We can use filters at night, but typically on a city at night, it's not the top or the bottom of the frame that's the brightest, it's normally the middle part. So we need to adapt for that. So what we can do is use this high dynamic range function. So in the histogram tab on Capture One, on the top left, we've got an option here that says, let's try and recover all of that highlight information. So what I've now got here is all of the individual traffic trails and all the strands. So I go from this, which is a bit of a bulbous mass of highlights, through to the individual lines of that traffic. So the camera recorded that information, but out of the chip, it's just letting it overblow. So we can pull that back using Capture One, and we can get some of that detail back into the highlights. I'm not going to use the shadow correction. In fact, I'll show you why, and that'll help us understand why. So let's turn shadow on. I've got a perfect picture for many people's Instagrams, but it's not something that I'd hang on my wall. As a reminder, if I recover all of the highlights and all of the shadows, what I'm actually doing, if I look at this histogram up here, is pushing all of the data that I recorded into the middle. I'm getting rid of all of the contrast out of the shot. So it's very unusual that anyone would say put highlights up to 100% recovery. Normally on a landscape, you wouldn't really venture above about 30%. But in a nighttime shot with light trails, this is what saves the day. The worst thing you can do is use that with shadow recovery as well. So we've got to choose, either we're recovering shadows or we're recovering highlights, never both together in a city shot.
It just means you get that nice 1990s HDR effect, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
So the other one that's also really useful, and again, it's one where we're very careful with this in landscapes. We're very careful to keep things looking very natural and very real. The clarity on a nightscape shot can look quite exciting, so let's put a little bit in there. All I've done with that is I've boosted the midtones. So I've forced the midtones to decide whether they're brighter or darker than the ones around them. That gives me this amazing glow over a city at night. If we do it too much, we've got to be careful that we don't end up, so you see here in these lights on top of the buildings, if we overdo that clarity slider again, so let's go back to how it was, and then let's put it up to 100% again. We get this sort of fake contrast, which ends up looking like halos around things. It ends up looking a little bit unreal. So personally, never more than about 35 to 40 on that clarity slider. But what that's giving me is a little bit of a boost in these areas where they're a bit washed out. It's normal in a city that you'll have haze or dust particles in the air and so on. Clarity can help cut through some of that. So it's one of the tools that we use quite a lot. So let's get back to the whole image. We fixed the traffic trails. We can see all of those nice and neatly. This is now straight on the edge. This is straight on the edge. We're going to fill that in later in terms of the top sky. But the other thing that's wrong in this picture from my memory is that the color balance in some of it is a little bit off. So this image actually, to my screen, looks a little bit too green compared to what I remember. So what we're going to do is, for a start, we're going to alter our white balance a little bit. So I'm just going to pull the temperature up a little bit just to be a tiny bit warmer. And I'm also going to pull this tint up. So in terms of this, if we think of this in terms of color scale, so Kelvin will bring you from an effective color scale from yellow to blue. So the further left we go, the cooler the temperature of the light's going to be. It's going to be blue. The further right, the warmer. We get to that almost horrible yellowy red color. So we won't leave it on there because that will hurt people's eyes. So for cities, as a general rule, and what I've found just through editing quite a few of these, is it's in the range of, at night, between 2,600 and 3,400 Kelvin. That typically gets you an accurate representation of the night air. Now, obviously, in different cities that changes, and we'll go through an example of that in a minute. But as a guideline, somewhere in there is about right. To give you an idea, if I switch this to daylight white balance, this is what the camera would have recorded. So obviously that's not what it looks like in real life. A lot of people have their cameras set to one particular white balance. Auto white balance can get it right most of the time. I'll show an example in a minute of where it doesn't. But at least giving people a guide here. So if we can get to a place where you're between 2,600 and 3,400-ish, you're going to be pretty safe for a nighttime shot. The tint, this is a way, certainly when using filters, of getting rid of filter color cast. So if you've got a filter in front of the lens which is giving you a slight pink color cast or a green color cast, we can correct it here. But actually in cities, we can actually use this to our advantage and sort of warm up some of these traffic areas here to give them a subtle little pink, little bit of pink glow around them. This, to me, matches pretty much what I remember seeing. What we don't want to go is too far. And obviously we don't want to make it unreal, but this is starting to get back to the reality rather than just what we captured raw out of the camera. The next thing, certainly in here with city, so obviously here on the left-hand side, where we're near this Dusitani building, we're actually pretty clear, pretty sharp. We've got a nice bit of contrast in there. That's all quite nice to view. Just wait for it to load up to make sure. Yeah, there we go. So nice and sharp, all good. I've got nice differential between the highlights and the shadows, and that's great. As I move into here, into the city area, which is downtown Dubai at the bottom of the Burj Khalifa, we start to lose some of that clarity. Now, as I said before, what I don't want to do is increase the clarity too much on the whole image because it starts looking completely fake. So what we can do is put in an adjustment layer. So in my adjustments area, I'm going to add a little layer. I'm just going to call this City Downtown. And we're going to add on a little painted area. So with my little paintbrush, I'm just going to increase the size of that. We keep it soft in terms of its outside edge because we want it to blend in quite seamlessly. And I'm just going to draw a little band. This will just highlight in red where I'm drawing while I'm doing that. Now we need to be a little bit careful that we don't overdo this, but all I'm trying to do is pull up the contrast and the detail in that downtown area that we were losing a little bit in the haze. So with that area drawn, I can now just pick on this one layer, so the city downtown, and just to overemphasize the effect, let's just whack the clarity right up on that area, and I'm also going to whack the contrast right up and put the exposure right down. So we can see the area we're affecting now. It's just that area here that we drew over. Obviously this is way too much, but what we can do is now just pull that back. So I want about half a stop of exposure less in there. I want a touch more clarity and a little bit more contrast. So all I've done now is just taken the heat out of this area here in the middle. And as I zoom in, let's just have a look in there. I've now got a lot more detail clawed back in those buildings just by increasing the contrast and the clarity around them without affecting the rest of the image. With that one done, the only thing for me then is this area down here has lost a little bit of its sparkle, so I'm just going to pull into a curve adjustment. So rather than using the RGB curve adjustment, which will also, it can have some strange effects on the saturation of the colors as well, I'm going to use this Luma curve. So I'm going to keep my shadows where they are, keep my highlights where they are, and just raise up these midtones just a little touch. As that processes, we just get a little bit of a boost in those colors around the street down at the bottom. And that's it for that picture. So we can go, let's go back to the raw. So there's the raw. There's not a huge amount wrong with it. In fact, I've just noticed there is one other thing wrong with this one, which is that annoying dust spot in the top left. So click on this tool up here. Let's make sure it's the right size for a little dust spot, and just one click, and that makes me feel a lot better. So we go from this raw out of the camera. Not a huge amount wrong with it. It's got a little bit of keystoning down here as a problem, but that's near the edge of the image, and a little bit of an issue around these highlights that are slightly blown out. A few little changes, and we're now into an image that pops, which is what we're aiming for. And
you know, going from what you said earlier, obviously these are all enhancements in Capture One.
Yep.
But it sounds like the way you shoot, you're not trying to fix errors as such. You're just improving on the environment that was in front of you, and I guess that's quite important.
Yeah, I mean, it's I'd say that's probably a learning curve. So
yeah.
when you first start at 100%, I was fixing the errors that I used to make when I captured, and we'll go on to some of the things that we can do to help with that in a second. But what actually happens is you start to become lazy. So I know that it's easier to get it right at the time than it is to spend an hour fixing it later on in Capture One.
Yeah, exactly.
The tool is capable of doing it, but it's just once you start to figure out what it is I'm changing, you can start to make some decisions when you're shooting. So for example, in this image, actually, if I go back to the raw, I can see actually here on the histogram, let's just pull this out, on this image where we were dealing with those highlights that were blown out over here. Actually, when I shot this picture, I had a little bit of latitude here in the histogram. I could have actually gone for either a slightly shorter exposure or for a slightly smaller aperture. And I could have got away with pushing this histogram a little bit to the left, which would have meant I'd have had less blown out in that far side if I look at it that way. So yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, all we're doing in Capture One is bringing it back to what we saw at the time, correcting for any little things. But obviously, sometimes things go wrong, and we can use it to fix for those as well.
David was asking, with the 28mm lens, do you ever find the edges are a problem in terms of sharpness?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think in reality, and we'll go into Sharpen in a minute just to have a look at it. Actually, let's pull up a real example. So a little bit into the edges here. Let's just pull that up. We're at, just get that out of my screen. So we're at 100% there. To me, this is pretty sharp. If we look at this area here, I'm pretty good. As we get to the edge here on the left, obviously you can see it starts to lose some of that sharpness. There are tools in here. So within Capture One, we can pull up this. So we can pull up our Sharpening Tool. The risk is that we over sharpen the center. As well, most people now will be familiar. So the Sharpening Tool also now comes with this really, really useful tool called halo suppression. So when you sharpen things that are on a high contrast edge, you can sometimes get a halo around them. So we use the halo suppression to counter that. Of course, we can use within the lens correction here. So I can pull up. In fact, this is the raw file, but let's just apply that lens correction so we can see exactly what it's doing on the raw. So we'll load in the lens profile. That'll have a small effect to start with in terms of diffraction as well. If I pull up this sharpness fall off, and to be specific, this isn't a sharpness tool. In fact, I can't get it to say the full word there. So the sharpness function here under distortion isn't sharpness of the whole image, it's sharpness fall off.
Yes.
And it's specifically to do what David's talking about, which is some lenses have an issue where they're less sharp at the edges than they are in the center. This tool specifically helps with that. So if you're finding that it's a bit too soft at the edges, just try and turn that up a little bit, see if it can fix it. But in general terms, yes, the 28mm can be soft at the edges.
Cool. And another David was asking, David Effens, do you meter in camera or eyeball it in or shoot tethered? I guess you've got a few different options.
Yeah, so a mix, to be honest. So metering in camera, there is a challenge with metering in camera at night, which is you actually get to know your camera. So I know that when my camera at night for a cityscape is telling me that it's -4, that's about right. Which sounds counterintuitive, but what it's telling me is that this scene is pretty dark. Well, yes, it is at night. Now, what it is, so yes, correct. Well done, camera. But actually, you sort of get to know it a little bit. So, in general terms, in a bright city, if you're at f11 ISO 50, you can shoot for between 20 and 60 seconds, and you'll be generally speaking okay. If you go down to f16, then obviously you're going to need a longer exposure time, but also what you tend to lose with f16 is the traffic as it's moving by. So it takes a lot more light to etch in onto the sensor while it's exposing. So typically on a city, I wouldn't go above f11, or sorry, smaller than f11. But yeah, f11 around 30 seconds at night. Typically that works for me, but the metering in camera, you just need to get used to what your camera is telling you and the output it gives you, and then remember that next time, and it becomes natural.
Nice. Okay, last question, then we go to the next image and come back for other questions. Michael wondered if you'd use the 35mm blue ring as a better alternative.
Yes. So this is a discussion I've had many times with Drew at phase 1.
Oh yeah.
I love the 35mm lens. It's a fantastic piece of kit. It is sharp, frankly, edge to edge. I can't knock it. It's an amazing piece of kit. However, it's 7mm too short.
Right.
And I'm just in that place of, and that's funnily enough, for cities, the sharpness at the edges is more of an issue. For landscapes, you can probably get away with a little bit more of it. So to me, if I did a 35mm equivalent on this, it would probably crop into sort of here where my mouse is on the left, up to here on the right. And I just want it a bit wider than that. So it's a fantastic lens. There is an option, obviously, you can take 2 pictures with the 35mm and then use tools like AutoPano or whatever to combine them. But personally, I love the 28mm width. It's just unfortunate that there isn't a blue ring one yet.
Who knows what comes in the future?
So next up, and more specifically in terms of architecture and buildings, so this was taken in Cuba. So this was one of the shots we shot during the POTUS workshop in April. A couple of things with this image. Number one, I'd had a couple of beers at the time, so it's slightly to the right in terms of lean. Secondly, it is also using a wide lens. Now, a wide lens is great because I can get the whole building in. But what it also gives me is some distortion as well for the building. So the building seems to travel away from me as it gets up higher. And we've got some of that white balance issue. So we're going to go through them sort of one by one. So first off, let's again just load in that lens correction. So load in the correct lens, put on diffraction correction, a little bit of distortion correction on this one. As David said earlier, we're gonna use that sharpness fall off correction as well. On this, interestingly, light fall off. I'm not too worried about light fall off on this shot. Any vignetting, it actually is incidental because there's nothing at the edges of interest. So we're going to leave that where it is. The one we are going to use is purple defringing. So what I know when I zoom into these edges over here around these lights, we've got some purple around these lights without the defringing turned on. So we're going to enable that. Now, what we have here is, for a start, a building that's a little bit rotated because of the position of the camera, but also these really heavy keystone lines. So if we look at this lamppost here, but also the building is leaning in as it goes up and leaning in to the left as it goes up on the right-hand side of the frame as well. So this time on that, the same Keystone tool, but instead of just using the vertical one, we're going to use this, the really complicated quad one, which actually isn't complicated at all. So what we've got to find to make Capture One do this automatically for me is 4 positions which are in straight lines, horizontally and vertically. Now, luckily on this building, it's even. So I know that the top of this tower here with the sculpture on it, I'm just going to go to the top of the light part, and the top of this tower are the same height, and they're also the same distance from each other. And I then know that if I draw a straight line down to street level, so I'm hoping the streets in Cuba are relatively even. Yeah, there were some issues sometimes, but in general they're there. And I'm going to pull this line down here as well. So again, just following that straight line down there to street level. Okay, hit apply in the middle, and let's see what we get. So there's my straightened building. Now if I go from where we were where we are, there are 2 things that have happened. So number 1, we've evened out this slight rotation on the shot. But number 2, and more importantly, we've now got something that effectively looks head on to that building. So going back to what I said at the very beginning, in an ideal world, we'd have used a tilt shift lens for doing an architecture shot like this. In reality, didn't have one in the bag. So what this tool allows us to do is to adapt to the fact that the lens has a slight distortion, a perspective distortion as a result, and that Keystone Correction pulls it back in. So number 1, we've now got our building. Number 2, I'm going to crop some of this. So just in the standard crop tool up here, whether people are a fan of 16:9, 2:3, whatever, but I'm just going to get rid of some of this less interesting stuff down here on the street front. I'm going to leave a little bit of headroom for that statue up there. So immediately we go into a more powerful image. We go from there into this. Now obviously we've got some highlights here again. They're a little bit blown out, and we've picked this picture specifically for that to demonstrate. So in these highlights here, it looks like we've lost all the detail in these these illuminated parts on the top of the building, which is a bit of a shame because actually it was really interesting. So let's see what we can do with Capture One. So let's again pull back that high dynamic range, and there's all the detail it actually had. So the amount, and this is one where, going back to what we said earlier, don't rely on these tools as such. If we can get it right in the camera, then great. But the advantage of tools like Capture One are, you know, if I go back to without this enabled, let's look at this statue here on the right, for example, that's blown out. There's no debate over it. I can't see any detail in that piece of architecture. By pulling in those highlights, I have all the data that the camera did record at the time. It's always been there. It just wasn't displaying to start with. So
it's quite the astonishing change there, isn't it?
It is. It really is. You know, and it's one where every now and then you get a picture and you think, oh, if only it wasn't, you know, slightly blown out or slightly underexposed. If we're talking slightly, this tool is fantastic for bringing that back. If we're talking way over, then yeah, good luck.
Yeah, there's a limit to everything for sure.
Yeah,
but I think
exactly.
I think people underestimate. I mean you're lucky because you have 100 megapixels to play with in great dynamic range. But even on other cameras, SLRs, mirrorless, I think people underestimate just how much range there is and disregard the image without even trying. So it's always worth trying.
Yeah, to be fair, I mean, I've seen images on a Sony A7R II that looked like they were unusable. Put it into Capture One, and it was stunning. Exactly. With a bit of correction on there. Yeah. Again, like we said before, I'm not going to pull that shadow up. If we do that, it just looks crazy. So we're going to leave the shadow where it is because I want some contrast. The only thing then that really remains on this one is just a little bit of punch of clarity, because I want to separate some of these lines a little bit more as well with the traffic trails, but also the color balance. So it wasn't this warm when we were shooting, and for example, like I said before, this was actually shot with a daylight color balance, which is why we've got this very orange glow at night. So first thing, let's pull down the color temperature. Let's pull it down into that sort of 3000-ish range. Let's get it into about there. I'm going to use a little bit of that pinkish tint just to warm up some of these lights so they don't go too green as we pull down the temperature. But then I'm going to use this color balance tool on the left, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want to control the shadows, the highlights, and the midtones a little bit separately in this shot. So What this tool allows me to do is to isolate the color balance across the three areas in the histogram between shadows, midtones, and highlights. So let's go to the extreme to demonstrate it. Let's make the highlights green. Let's make the shadows pink. And there we go. So there's a good example of what not to do. But what it's showing very clearly is I obviously couldn't do that if I was just dealing with the one main color balance for the whole image. Because I'd only have the choice of moving the whole image, either more magenta, more green, more yellow. The three-way tool, which is actually a combination of these shadow, midtone, and highlights areas, allows me a lot more control. So in this case, I want to pull the shadows to be a little bit cooler, a little bit blue, and also I'm going to darken them down a little bit. The midtones I'm sort of okay with. We'll pull them a little bit to the pink side, and the highlights I'm just going to pull up to be a little bit more orangey red. Let's just pull it into about there. So I go from this sort of over yellow, over the top image into a much cooler, genuinely more realistic view of the tower. In this one, there's probably a little bit of scope where I could pull the exposure up a little bit. Now that I've pulled down those highlights, I've recovered those a little bit. I could, in theory, pull up the shadows a little bit so we get some of the detail back in this part of the building that's not illuminated. But in broad terms, this is what we saw. This is obviously what the camera recorded with my slightly rotated tripod at the time. And that's it, with probably adjusting only about 5 or 6 things. We get to a very different image at the end.
Definitely, and again, if you just saw that on the back of your camera, you might think, Jesus, there's nothing to salvage here, just purely on the color alone. But there's so much data lurking in the raw file. It's just a case of interpreting it really how you want to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Philip was asking, do you ever use linear response? Ever find that a benefit in the base character?
Yep. So let me pull a picture that I'm not actually going to edit, but we'll use it as an example. So what Philip's referring to is in my within my histogram area for the base characteristics here, I've got a curve, which generally speaking is auto. Personally, especially for city stuff, auto generally does me fine. When we go into either landscapes or portraits and stuff like that, and I want to see, I want a little bit more control over how the curve's going, we can use this one, which is linear response. If I show you what it will do to a city image now, you might be surprised. So we end up with this sort of flattening down of the shot. Personally, what I've found is I then end up spending an awful lot of time in curves here and playing with some of the levels to get it back to what Capture One actually had as auto anyway. Right. So I'm sort of, yes, it's great. It certainly helps to keep you focused on refining the levels that are coming out of the picture. But especially for city stuff at night and this sort of work, generally speaking, I end up pretty much where the auto would have got me anyway, and then tweaking from there. So right. Yes, yes, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to start with. There are images where it actually helps because you can focus on pulling out shadows where there's lack of contrast and stuff. But personally, I'm not too worried about the auto function on that one.
Good stuff. And last question from Jim. We saw you using clarity earlier. Yeah. Do you ever throw in a bit of structure as well onto shots? Yes. I'll show you an example actually of where we do. Let's pull up this one. So this is the lovely, wonderful, clean air of Beijing. Yes. So if I use clarity alone, it will do a pretty good job. But actually, what I tend to find, especially with cities with haze, is structure is very good at the edges of defining areas in the picture. So as a combination between the two, between clarity and structure, clarity has more of a visual impact to start with. When you start getting into the smaller details in the image, and we start, doing dodging and burning later on to try and get rid of some of this gunk in the sky. So we see here. So if I disable structure here, we can see these trees here are losing
quite a bit of contrast and quite a bit of detail. Let's pull structure right the way up, just so we can see. So obviously they've now popped out. We can see a lot more of them, which is great. But on the downside to it, what I've also now got is some introduced noise. And I've now got to sort of deal with that in a different way. So structure is great for defining area or defining detail in the image. And certainly in an image like this, where I'm losing detail because of the air and the atmosphere, it can be great. But on the flip side, I know that I'm going to have more work to do later on in terms of noise reduction. So a bit like clarity, yes, I use it, but try and use it sparingly or only where you need to.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. It has a tipping point where it sort of goes the wrong way, but I think for certain aspects of the image, it's always worth thinking, like you did with the first shot where you brushed in clarity. There's no reason why you couldn't brush in a bit of structure too.
Exactly, we could brush in structure. So on this one here, I could pull in a new adjustment layer. Let's just add it on there. Let's just draw over here to that layer, fine. And then on this one alone, in just this area, I could pull up the structure. So that's now got my trees nicely defined, but I haven't affected things like the edges of the buildings and the roads and stuff.
Yeah, which are pretty sharp as they are, so they don't really need anything else. Yeah. Cool. Perfect.
Okay. So next one, and probably the final one we'll go through, and this is around, again, it's in terms of color balance and color temperature, but it's an interesting one to have a look at. So this is a junction in Shanghai called the Nine Dragon Interchange. It's a folklore tale about it, and this massive metal column in the middle is basically decorated with 9 dragons, hence the name. But Shanghai, a lot of people thought that the James Bond movie with Skyfall was all CGI with the bright blue roads and stuff like that, and actually no, it really is like that. So Shanghai has bright blue roads on a Friday and Saturday night. It's quite fun to drive through. So this is out of the camera, shot at a white balance of a daylight setting, so 5000 Kelvin with no tint applied to it. So that actually looks pretty accurate to how the roads look and feel when you're there at night. So now I'm going to take you up to a rooftop that looks out over this interchange. So with exactly the same white balance setting, the exact same tint setting, the exact same settings, we get this. Which a lot of people are surprised at because, well, hold on a second, it's got all warm. And the problem is that when you're up high, obviously all of the orange light from the city starts to affect you more than on the ground. So we've got this huge disparity between the cool blue down here and then this big orange glow up at the top. One thing we're not going to do in this image, and we'll explain why in a second, is fix the keystoning. And I'll show you at the very end why we're not going to do that. This is one where if we wanted to have the buildings completely straight, we should be on a tilt shift basis. Without it, I'm not too worried because the emphasis on this shot is obviously this road, not the buildings at the edge. So we're in the same place with these overblown highlights a little bit in this one, but first off, let's just pull on that same lens correction. Let's pull in this one. And I'm going to use those same sort of distortion settings. So a little bit of distortion correction because I know that we've got a little bit of fisheye on the lens. I don't want to use too much because what we'll see is you see these buildings at the edges, we start to lose content if we overdo that. And I know that this image is distorted, it's meant to be, it's an ultra wide lens. A bit of sharpness fall off. Not too worried about the light fall off, but we'll fix it a little bit. And for sure, the purple defringing. I'm going to turn that on because I know that where we've got these high contrast areas, that's a challenge. From there, so again, I mentioned earlier that a good place to be at is that sort of between 2600 to 3400 white balance without having to experiment too much. If I literally just bring this down to around 3000 or 2900, I'm going to pull the tint up a little bit, that's what Shanghai looks like. So yes, I can then tweak it a little bit more. So I can say, actually, I want it to be a bit cooler. Let's go a bit more mid-90 on it. But in general terms, without too much tweaking, as long as I stay within that band, I know that I'm going to get back to what a city should look like at night. We can obviously use a little eyedropper, so I can pick on an area that should be completely grey or white. In this image, it's actually quite difficult because obviously everything's bathed in blue light. So the grey concrete actually isn't grey in real life. And if I click on that, it's going to confuse the system a little bit. So what I can do is click on one of the headlights, because I know they would be white, and we get relatively close to what it is. What it has done, though, and referring back to that tint thing, is I've introduced a lot of green up here in terms of the building colours, which isn't to my liking. It may be to other people's. So I'm just going to pull this down back to a bit cooler like we had before, and pull this tint back up a little bit. So we're back to something that's a bit more representative of what was there. Let's just put it into there. So from there, same sort of deal. Let's look out here. So we've got this horrible issue again with overblown highlights. I've picked this one intentionally. So this is, funnily enough, going back to the question earlier about metering in the camera. Here's a good example. So this is the first shot that we shot. I'm using it specifically so that we can pull back some highlights so we can see. But yes, typically meter in the camera, trust it a little bit, get to where you're comfortable with, and then adjust. So the actual shot that we did of this, the final one, was actually a lot darker as a raw file. But going back to that point around the dynamic range, so in this histogram here, we can see in theory we've lost a huge amount of detail up here on this right hand side as all of these lights are going off the edge of the histogram. In practice, let's give it a go. So there's my highlight correction or recovery. Up here, I can tell you now for a fact, even if I have this on F16 and for 2 seconds, the amount of light that's down there will blow out. It's just solid traffic in the distance, so we've kind of got to get over that one. But certainly in these areas here, we've now got all this detail back in this concrete. We've got all the detail back in the lights. So again, let's put it back down to none. We're overblown here. We'll pull it back up, and we've got all this detail back in the shot. We can play a little bit with color balance, just like we did before. So let's just pull back to the full shot. So in the same way with these wheels, I'm going to do something very similar. So in the highlights, I want them to be a little bit red or yellow. So I'm going to keep these lights warm. But the shadows, I want to keep nice and cool. We know it's meant to be, the bright blue color. Midtones, I can play with if I want to a little bit, but actually I'm just going to leave them where they are. They're pretty good in the middle. From there, back again, so clarity, a little bit of a touch. On this one, we can play with contrast as well. So let's pull that up. Now, what that's doing is, these areas of the midtones up here in the sky, we're going to force them back to the left-hand side of the histogram, pulling up the contrast. The problem with doing it is we're also losing some of the midtones here in the middle of the shot. So I do want this shot to end up quite dark in the sky. It doesn't look right to my eye that this is all really bright, and then we've got a bright sky up here as well. It should be fading out. So all I'm going to do is add a new adjustment layer. So instead of, let's just give it a call of sky. Instead of painting the sky, we're going to add a gradient mask on there instead. And I'm just going to draw that in here. Now I've got to be careful, obviously this building up here doesn't get too dark. We're just going to pull that exposure on the top of the shot down. So we get a nice fall off of light as it starts to go. I can redraw that gradient to be longer if I want to. So let's pull that back down there. That's probably a bit better there. And then we're kind of onto the final thing, which is then the rotation and the keystoning of this shot and why we're not going to change it. So first off, let's just look at before. That was where we were at. Remembering that actually the light that illuminates these roads should feel like this. So we go from there, which is what the camera saw in the same settings and white balance as before, and we get back down to this, which obviously looks a lot more realistic
Yes.
and a lot cooler. So let's have a look at now what we can do with keystoning, because obviously when we were looking at this one here, we were saying, well, you know, buildings at the edge, it would be nicer if they were straight and up to the edge, and obviously on this one it looks a lot better if it's geometrically correct. So why wouldn't I do it on this one? Well, if we remember how it actually fixes that keystoning and we can see it, let's just pull this up and pull the crop back. So I'm going to show you now what was cropped and what wasn't, and we can see the shape that it's had to morph that image into to straighten the building. So we can see it's made the top's ultra wide and the bottom quite narrow and twisted a little bit as well. So it's become a trapezoid, which means we're losing a lot of this data on the left and right when it's cropped down. On this shot, it doesn't matter because it was all dark anyway. But on this shot, if I do the same thing, so let's pull in that keystoning. So I'm going to do the same. So we're going to pick on a straight line. Again, relying on the building being built straight, but it should be. So let's pull that one there. We can already see from that line, this is quite an extreme angle that we're going to apply. And the same on this building. So let's pull that corner up there and the corner here. One thing just to bear in mind when you're doing keystone corrections, there's a tendency that people have to try and use bits in the middle. I'm not sure why we're all drawn to doing that. The further out to the outside that you go, the more accurate that keystone tends to be when it's doing the calculation. So if you use a building that's only maybe half a degree off, you can get it very wrong, and a small deviation can make a big difference. When we're out here at the edges, even if I am a tiny little bit off on that corner, it's not going to affect it too badly.
Yeah, that's actually a good tip, because yeah, if you are in the middle, you know, a little tiny tweak can really throw the calculation off. But if as far out to the edge as possible, even if you've fluffed it a little bit, it's probably not going to matter.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just apply that. So here's my huge, very big, wide image, which I'm really loving. And I love the fact that you've got the energy of the roads coming in. So let's now correct the keystoning. And let's just apply the crop that it needs to be able to do that with the wasted space. And now I have a pretty useless picture. So a couple of things. There is a limit to how much we can actually correct for keystoning. So it hasn't actually got it quite straight at the edges. We could push it a little bit more. I can actually push it a little bit beyond straight, so it'll correct for it. It's great because this middle building is now completely straight and vertical. These buildings are more vertical and so on. But I've lost the top of the building. I've lost the edge on the left, I've lost the edge on the right. And if I pull back to the wider crop, look at how much data I've just deleted out of that shot by doing it. So it is one where, and if we wanted to, we can bring that building back in. So let's go to an unconstrained crop. And I'm just going to make sure that we get as much of that building in as possible. So we could do this. It's a pretty strange aspect ratio for a photo. It doesn't look too comfortable to look at. But you know, yeah, okay, everything's straight in that image. But personally, I would leave it where it was before and accept the fact that you're looking down on a city. And it was where I was talking about before. Yes, we need to fix this little rotation of that building, so we can just use the rotate tool up here. We can do it manually if we want to, or I can just drop a line around the center of the image on an area that I know is going to be vertically correct. So let's just pull that down there. Okay, so I haven't lost too much, but at least we've got that image now that's straight in the middle. What it has done, obviously, is it's actually exaggerated the angles and the edges and the corners. But I have a challenge with this quite often, especially when you're shooting ultra wide. There comes a point where you have to accept that we're looking down on a picture, which means when you're on an ultra wide lens, as things get nearer to you, they get bigger, and they start to spread, and they start to change their angles as you look down on them. So if we take this one, for example, it looks perfectly natural that on this side of the frame, the buildings are tilting to the left. On this side of the frame, the buildings are tilting to the right. I could very quickly fix this. So let's just do that standard setting again. So now we're into our cool city. If we look at, for example, this globe here on the top of the Pearl Tower, it's nice and round at the moment. If I fix that keystoning completely, so again, straight lines. So let's pull this building in here. That's nice and straight. I'm going to use this building here to be straight. I'm going to lose an awful lot of this picture, but it's also going to, oh, I didn't apply, that was my fault. So let's just apply that. It's like, why didn't that work? But what it's also done now, yeah. So it's great, it's nice and straight, but again, I've lost all of this data on the left and the right hand side, but I've also squashed this tower. And it starts to look a little bit odd if I do this too much, because here I've got this circle up the top, but as I get down, you get this slight slant on the shape of the bottom of the tower, and things start to squash. and it's squashed where where Capture One has tried to correct for all of that distortion here, and pull the image out at the bottom and squeeze it in at the top. So you can actually end up with an image that looks less natural as a result of trying to correct it to be more straight. So it's just sort of a word of warning of there are times where I would just leave it alone. And it's one where, again, it's no different to the other tools. Use them when you need to, don't use them when you don't.
And also in the Keystone Correction, the default correction is actually 80%, not 100, because again, 100 looks weird.
Very good point.
It's just too good. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we go back into our keystoning on here, actually on this one we actually had it on 100, but the default that comes out of the box will have it here set down to about 80.
Yeah, just so it has a little bit of kick out.
There's a little bit of a, yeah, exactly. And again, it's about making sure that it doesn't look completely unnatural. It can actually look very uncomfortable if everything in the picture is
perfect,
unusually perfect.
Yeah.
So,
because I guess it's not what our eyes expect. If you stand in the street and look up, buildings get smaller. If you stand on top of a building and look down, they're bigger at the top. Yeah.
And same with this one is another example of exactly that. So all I would be doing on this one, let's cool it down for sure. Let's pull in some highlight correction just like we do normally. But would I straighten this? Probably not. It looks better that we're looking down, in my view. But then again, it's personal preference.
Absolutely, yeah. But I tend to agree. Well,
okay.
I think that takes us up to pretty much the end of our time. I actually do have one question from Juan, which is quite a good one to finish on, I think. He says, some people say that the best time to shoot city nightscapes is just after the blue hour. I don't know what that is, but you probably do. Yep. But others prefer to shoot when the sky is really dark. What do you think?
It depends what you're trying to get. So just after blue hour, let's give you an example. This is an example of that. And in fact, actually, this one is it's just a little bit later than that one was taken. You've still got texture in the sky, so we still have a little bit of hint of light hitting the clouds. We still have you can still see stars. And this one is a slightly long exposure, so you see one there. Well, that may be even the plane, but typically in a clear sky you'll see stars just after blue hour as well. But what it does mean is you've got texture in the sky. And actually, so if I take this one, for example, I could put in a little layer up here, and we could use the fact that we've still got color in the sky to our advantage. And just on that piece up there, we could bring up the saturation a little bit. We could also play with our dynamic range and also change that Kelvin a little bit. So we could get that sky back to something that's a bit more of a cool glow, and we can get some more detail back in the sky, which is great. After this, so about half an hour after this sort of setup, which is normally about half an hour after sunset, you're back into this territory where there is nothing in the sky apart from stars. If you're in a very, very busy city, such as this one, so Dubai, you will never see a black sky. Because there's so much light coming from the city, whether you're in blue hour or not, it really doesn't matter. But if you're outside of that, the second you get away from blue hour, you start to lose any detail in the sky. And then the risk is, just like in the shot, you end up with a sort of floating object rather than any background. So I'd be, and again, so in the middle of a city, this is actually a black sky, but obviously there's so much light bouncing off of the haze in the city that you lose it. So I'd be in a place where just after blue hour, if there is detail in the sky and you can see it, it can look really nice. Personally, I would do it around that time. But obviously, as well, sometimes you don't necessarily have that option in a city. So I've been allowed access onto a rooftop at 2 o'clock in the morning, and tough. There's no light in the sky, so sort of deal with it. But yeah, as an ideal world, I would be looking for a little bit of texture, a little bit of detail up there.
Cool, fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Okay. That was a nice way to wrap it up. I think I'm going to steal the presentation rights back from you. 1 second, and try not to screw it up. Hang on. It did. Just to warn everybody, the last time I did this with a co-presenter, it crashed and the webinar ended. So let's
goodbye in advance.
Goodbye in advance in case that happens. So let's see if it works. Hang on, just need to bring Keynote back up. There we go. So next webinar, if you want to come back for more, is October 5th. And that's actually nothing adjustment based, that's all workflow based. So that's talking about strategies like someone like Paul could use, which is if you're working on location, file management wise, if you want to work on 2 different systems, how do you work on, say, a laptop and then get pictures back with adjustments, ratings, and so on onto a system back at home? So kind of all workflow based, less about adjustments. Yeah, it often comes up. You know, you might shoot on a laptop, whether that's architecture, fashion, portrait, headshots, you name it, and then you get back home and then you want to transfer everything to Mac or PC. But keeps the work that you might already have done at the shoot time and carry on without hindrance and nicely organized. So that's what we're doing next time. So give us a sign up, and you'll see tomorrow when you'll get a follow-up email, and we have all the links in there for the forthcoming webinars as well. So look out for that follow-up email tomorrow, and that will have the YouTube link of where you can watch the recording again if you wish. Great. All right, Paul. Thanks again for your help. Right. And no where are you off to? Shanghai next for another workshop, correct?
I've Germany for a day and then Shanghai for many weeks. So yeah.
Many weeks. Excellent. Yeah. Well, enjoy the clean air out there. And thanks again, and catch up with you soon.
Cool. Cheers.
Thanks, Paul. Take care.
Bye-bye.